So this particular scripture, part of it that I'm going to focus on, is the wedding and the changing of the water into wine. And it's been really hard not making jokes about it. And I'm going to stick to that, I think. Anyway, but when I grew up, we used to get the New Yorker and the Saturday Evening Post, and 50% of the jokes were about someone who had drunk too much. They were always hiccuping. Sometimes I remember we had little hand towels, guest towels in the bathroom, and there was always ones with a drunk holding on to a lamppost, and again, hiccuping. So there was a lot of humor around drinking and alcohol in that sort of Mad Men era. And then now I feel like we know the power of alcohol, and we know the pain of it. So we don't make as much fun of it, but surely it's a good business to be in terms of profit. But the wine that would have been served at that wedding would have been homemade. And it would have been made by the bridegroom and his family, and by the bride's family, and maybe a few relatives as well. They'd most likely been saving it up in preparation for this wedding. And a wedding, like now, but then even more, was a big celebration. It went on for days, and in a town as small as Cana was, the location for the wedding would have been the village, the square, or wherever around the well where people gathered. You could not invite someone in that kind of a setting. That space would accommodate the number of people. That space would be public. So running out of wine, to us, or to me anyway, I'll say, is a disappointment. But it's not the end of the wedding. And it wouldn't have been the end of that wedding either. But it would have reflected badly on the bridegroom's family, because hospitality was such an important characteristic. It was so much one of the ways that you showed that you were a God-fearing person, and you would always give away whatever food you had to someone who came in, and having a wedding meant lots and lots of food. And everyone wants their wedding to be remembered, but not as the one where they ran out of wine. And Jesus' mother saw that they had the wine casks were not filled. And she knew that it would have been a real shaming embarrassment for the family. So she talks to her son to try to avert this crisis. The hosts, though, seem blissfully unaware that any moment they could be embarrassed. Even in that era, the preparation had been intense. But maybe you all remember your own weddings, the preparing for the weddings, and how on the day of the wedding, you finally relax. You have friends and family. Your choices have all melted away into this beautiful, or at least cordial celebration. Old friends mingling with new acquaintances, eating, drinking, dancing, drinking, but the wine cask is empty. Maybe Uncle Harry, who has a hollow leg, showed up early and stayed upright longer than they had expected. Maybe they had more guests than they had been planning. Maybe the guests who were supposed to bring extra wine didn't bring it. But for whatever reason, the wine cask was empty, as were the 6 stone jars that had been used for ritual cleaning by everyone coming in. And so that water in there had been used up, and the jars were standing there unused. And the wedding couple are just a hair's breadth away from learning that their wedding is about to change and not for the better. I wonder how many times we've been in that position, how many times we've been on the precipice of something negative, and Jesus has stepped in to save us. We don't know the time and the place, but we'd be fools to think it hadn't happened. There is no other possible explanation than that for my life. Lately, I think because we're starting to talk about college with Autumn, I've looked at the map of my life and I've marveled at why I chose what I chose. What I've gleaned had nothing at all to do with planning for a future. I went to a junior college because my brother flunked out of a 4-year college, and my mother was so traumatized she didn't want to go through that again. I chose the junior college I chose because someone I had a crush on had gone there once before. After graduation, I transferred and went to a 4-year institution in Florida because my parents wanted to retire there. I dropped my major of economics because when I went into my first class of labor economics, they were all men or boys, and there was just me, and they asked, "Oh, are you in labor?" and could not stop giggling at their amazing joke. And this was in the late 60s. Anyway, I could go on telling you all of the frivolous reasons I've made most of my decisions. But I looked back over that in wonder. And I look at my life now and marvel at the way it has unfolded. When I look at those choices so capriciously made, and at where they took me, I can only see Jesus accompanying me like a border collie, nudging me towards the right path and heading me off the wrong one. I went to Florida Presbyterian College. What was that? I mean, I don't know. When I moved into my first alone apartment, I went to the local congregational church to try to make friends. And then to try to make sense of my life, I went to Al-Anon and found a profound relationship with God there. And as I was writing this sermon, I took out my high school yearbook and looked at it. I had a great time. It was a boarding school in high school. And everybody said, stay as sweet as you are. But under my picture, the yearbook people had selected a quote for everybody. And my quote was, "I thank heaven someone's crazy enough to give me a daisy." At the time, I didn't realize how apt that quote was, and now I do. It can be on my gravestone as well. Heaven has loved me and guided me. How many times has Jesus stepped into your life without your awareness? How many roads not taken in your life were bypassed because of that voice in your head or the knot in your stomach were put there by Jesus? How often have you taken the wrong path but allowed Jesus to lead you out of it unawares? The 6 stone jars at this wedding were initially filled with water, as I said, and they would have held between 20 and 30 gallons. That's the size of the trash barrels people put out on their sidewalks. That's what they would have put, that's the amount of wine that would have been in one of them. That's a lot of wine. That's a lot of good wine. And the bridegroom's reputation for hospitality, which, as I said, was very important, had grown in leaps. Not only had he not run out of wine, but he's serving the Margot or whatever at the end or the middle of the wedding, rather than the $2 chuck, which would be brought out in my house anyway. And only the servants and Jesus' newly chosen disciples witnessed not this miracle. It's often called Jesus' first miracle, but John doesn't call it a miracle. He calls it a sign. He's very intentional about using that word. He opens the chapter saying, we are on the third day. The third day after John the Baptist has introduced Jesus to the world, and God has descended from heaven with words claiming Jesus as his son. John, who was the writer of this gospel, not John the Baptist, is anxious now that Jesus has come. He's anxious to tell us something about who Jesus is and something about who God is. Everything that Jesus tells us everything that Jesus does tells us something about who he is. And everything that Jesus shows us is God as well. John, just a second. Chardonnay. I couldn't help it. Anyway, so John is writing in a time when Christianity is being changed and challenged. It's being watered down, mostly by other beliefs, that not so much by people rejecting Christianity, but by their changing it through what was referred to as a heresy, Gnosticism. Gnosticism was attempting to put its stamp on the emerging church. The basic belief of Gnosticism is that there are two worlds, one which is created, that is defiled and defiling, and the spiritual one, where beauty and knowledge exist. Gnosticism cannot coexist with Jesus, who is fully human and fully divine at the same time. So John's mission is to dispel this heresy and show us who Jesus is, human and divine. And what do we learn from this first public act of Jesus's? Why is it that John decides to really start off that way? Well, we learn that Jesus came to the marginalized. I know you hear that a lot here, but not as much as Jesus said it and showed it. He took every opportunity he could to reinforce the new order. The last shall be first. No Gnostic anywhere would associate with the uneducated and the lowly. What else? Well, we learn that God is a God of abundance. 6 stone jars, 120 gallons of wine. We learn Jesus delights in community, much more than today. A wedding in Cana was a community celebration. Jesus delights in our community here today, especially in the circumstances of weather. That community draws us to Jesus because Jesus loves community. And we learn that Jesus is fully human, that he enters into a celebration, that his first public act is a celebration, is something where people are relaxed and enjoying themselves. And this, John wants us to see, God has come to earth to be one with us, to be one of us. And what else do we learn? We learn that God does not desire ill for us. Jesus probably realizes that the wine calculation was inadequate, and he steps in to save the bridegroom. He doesn't leave us in the mire we walk into with our eyes wide open. Jesus has no desire for us to fail, for us to be embarrassed or humiliated. Nor does he have a desire to receive credit and accolades for saving our bacon, saving the wedding. I've heard the question asked, who is Jesus for you? And people have all different ways of understanding Jesus. And we know here that there is a huge variety of beliefs. We don't talk about them, so we don't know where people fall on any continuum. But we each probably have different ideas in our heads about who Jesus is. But there is no scenario of Jesus that doesn't offer us abundance. No scenario where God doesn't have a special affinity for the poor. And known or unknown, there is no life that has gone untouched by God, no sorrow unshared or catastrophe averted. This was the beginning of Jesus' ministry. And the story leads us right away to expect surprisingly good and abundant things to come as Jesus' ministry unfolds. Starting the story with the provision of wine, we can see a mission continuing God's work in this world that provides hospitality, belonging for all, and the end of the honor and shame, who's in and who's out, who can have the good wine and who cannot. Jesus started and meant to go on and continue with the best wine there is. Amen.